without further ado, let's go ahead and get started on our program for today. We're going to talk about the history of medicine in the U.S. military between the Civil War and World War II. And this kind of came out of a few years ago when the Career Academy first opened upstairs. We did a series of programs for some of the students that were in the nursing program and such, and kind of showing military artifacts and combined with medical equipment that was used, and it proved to be I thought a pretty interesting program, and I thought I'd try it out on you once too. But the interesting thing, the reason I chose this period is this is the period when modern medicine really took its form, and it had a profound impact on the survivability of the conflicts that the United States was involved in as time went on. And that's kind of odd because during the same period of time, the weapons of war got steadily more deadly. But the amazing thing was, because of the developments in medicine, your chances of surviving World War II, if you were in the U.S. military, were quite a bit better than surviving the Civil War, just because more than anything, that your chances of dying of disease, communicable disease, was so much less. And really, the military conflicts, because of the emergency situation, in many ways pushed along the technology and the advances in medicine. And so the two things are quite related in this kind of odd way, back and forth way. And I find that interesting, and I hope that you will too. So I think there are a couple of big themes that we need to keep in mind. The biggest thing is what medicine was able to do was really limit how deadly communicable disease was, spread from person to person. So that's one thing. And then the other thing was the spread of infection, especially if you were wounded in battle. In the Civil War, we'll see infection was a major problem. By World War II, that really had been reeled back and was under control in a major way. The other thing is surgery got a lot better and more effective. And then the third thing is that finally, by World War II, there were very effective medicines in place, particularly the sulfa drugs and penicillin during World War II that helped treat disease. And so we'll see that those are kind of the big themes, I think, that we're going to trace. So let's start out with the U.S. Civil War. Started in 1861 and went until 1865. In the Civil War, in the Union forces, there were about 2 million men under arms, and the Confederate forces had over 1 million, or around 1 million. And in over 360,000 Union military people perished in the war. In the Confederates, somewhat less than 300,000, but altogether, over 650,000 Americans died in the American Civil War, which is easily the most in American history. As a matter of fact, it's almost as much as all other American wars combined to this day. Now, what you'll see, I have some percentages that I worked out. First off, what you'll see is the rate of non-battle deaths is quite high, up around 10%. For the Confederates, as much as 20%. And those non-battle deaths are mostly disease. Probably 80 to 90% are disease. Some of them are accidents and things like that. But it's mostly communicable disease and infection, especially after one was wounded in battle. And so, battle deaths, the average Union soldier had about a 6% chance of dying in battle, but your chance of dying of a non-battle cause was substantially greater. Now, I want to go through and we'll talk about kind of what people were facing in each conflict in terms of weapons. The big thing in the American Civil War, the big innovation was the rifled musket, and I have a picture of that here. And what was the big thing about this was a rifled musket. Before this, the main small arm in the U.S. military was a smooth bore gun. That means the inside of its barrel was just smooth like a shotgun. Rifling are grooves that are in a spiral formation inside the barrel, and they impart a spin on the projectile, and it makes the gun much more accurate. And so those old smoothbore muskets before the Civil War were only accurate out to about 50 yards or so, whereas the rifled musket was pretty deadly out to 200 or more yards. And so that was a major change. And keep in mind, in every conflict, the generals are always fighting the last war, and so the tactics almost always reflect what was in place before. And as a result, in the Civil War, casualty rates were very high in battle. Now, the rifled musket shot what was called a mini ball, and that was a soft lead 58 caliber projectile that would fit into those grooves, but it was muzzle loaded, so the soldier had to load it from the top of the barrel down, and what they had a separate patch that had held the black powder that would be put in, and then the ball on top of that, and then it was rammed home, and a really good rifleman in the Civil War could shoot about 3 rounds in a minute. So not real fast, but quite a good rate of fire. I also have a pistol of the era as well. Now, the other thing that was very important in the Civil War was artillery. And so here we have the main cannon on both sides in the U.S. Civil War was the 12-pounder Napoleon cannon. And they fired projectiles like you see there, and I have some examples up here too. You had things that like a solid shot, which is just a solid cannonball. And then you also had an exploding shell was available. But the thing that was really devastating in the Civil War was canister shot. And these were metal canisters like you see there, filled with little balls like this. And they were basically like a big shotgun. And so in a lot of the big battles in the Civil War, like Fredericksburg and Antietam and Shiloh and Gettysburg, some of the most devastating parts of those battles were when one side or the other was charging a defended position, and they would open up on them with these canister rounds, and it would just mow them down, and it was really devastating. Also, the rifling extended into artillery, and so here we have an example of the 3-inch rifled gun that was used by both sides in the Civil War. And I do have a couple of examples of rifled shells that would have been shot by an artillery piece like that up here as well. Now, when the Civil War began, there just was no organized medical apparatus in the U.S. military. The doctors volunteered to help out, but there was no real ambulance service. There were no combat medics. A lot of the people that were charged with going out to the battlefield and bringing the wounded back to the field hospitals were volunteers or were civilians that hadn't been trained to work in combat conditions. And so as a result, in the early battles, like the First Battle of Bull Run and even into Shiloh in early 1862, these people hadn't been prepared for what combat was like at all. And so a lot of times the people that were the stretcher bearers would just run away, which I think almost all of us would if, it's a matter of self-preservation. And so then they would be left without any medical care at all during the midst of the battle. And this began to change because Dr. Jonathan Letterman founded the U.S. Ambulance Corps the Union Ambulance Corps, and the Confederacy followed suit fairly soon after, right before the Battle of Antietam, which was in September 1862. And Antietam was to this day, is the deadliest battle in American history. So it was a good thing that this was established. And the Ambulance Corps, first off, trained the combat medics, the stretcher bearers, the ambulance drivers. So we have a picture here of one of the ambulance groups training for what they would have to do in battle and to get the wounded off the field. And at this point in the Civil War, that's basically was the idea, was just to get them off of the field and back to a field hospital. Later, the medical care on the battlefield grew exponentially, but at this point, they were just trying to get them onto an ambulance and off of the battlefield. So here's a couple of pictures of what a typical Union field hospital would have looked like. It would have been some distance behind the main battle lines, wherever this was. And a lot of the Civil War was fought in the state of Virginia. And of course, some battles were fought farther west, but that was kind of the main theater of battle. And so you can see the tent set up. And then there were bigger hospitals in places like Washington, D.C., Richmond, Virginia, Atlanta, Georgia, places like that. Now, one of the big fallacies of the Civil War is that surgery was done during the Civil War without anesthesia. That is absolutely not true. Almost all surgical, whether it were amputations or surgical procedures during the Civil War, was done under anesthesia. There are only a couple of recorded incidents, and they both involved Confederate soldiers where they had just run out of anesthesia, and so some types of amputations took place under those conditions. But for the most part, in a lot of movies about the Civil War, you see amputations with people not under anesthesia, and that just didn't happen in reality. In fact, anesthesia was pretty well established. The use of chloroform and ether had started in the 1840s, and it was well developed by the 1860s when the U.S. Civil War took place. The most commonly used anesthetic was chloroform. Chloroform was very effective. If you had to do a procedure, a person could be rendered unconscious with chloroform in about 7 minutes. Ether was safer because it was not as toxic as chloroform, but it took longer. It took up to 17 minutes to get somebody sedated for surgery, which a person could possibly die in that time period. And so chloroform was preferred, even though it was much touchier. But overall, the record of the use of anesthesia in the Civil War was pretty good. There were not a lot of incidents where people died as a result of the anesthesia. Now, the image we do have of Civil War medicine is the amputations, and that there's a good reason for that. It really has to do with the type of weapon that was used in the Civil War, and that mini ball in particular, which was a soft lead bullet, when it would, and large caliber, when it would hit you, instead of going through and making a fairly small hole, it tended to just shatter the bone. And so if you got hit in a lower extremity, in your arm or your leg, there oftentimes was no other recourse but to remove the damaged part of the limb. And so amputations were definitely a very common procedure. Oh, and here we have a close-up of we have a Civil War era medical kit, surgeon's kit in our collection. Kind of the things that you would need. You have the bone saw for the larger bones like the femur and the humerus in the arm. You have a large amputating knife and smaller saws for fingers and things like that. Nasty stuff here, but a lot of these types of tools are still in more modern form used in surgery, and so a lot of that was in place. You have the tourniquet to control breathing. You even have a trach tube for aiding in breathing if somebody's airway is obstructed. And so, while gruesome, also very much the beginnings of modern surgery that we have in a kit like this. Now, unfortunately, during the American Civil War, the germ theory of disease had not been established, and right after the Civil War ended was when the idea of antiseptic surgery was put in place. And if that had been in place during the Civil War, countless lives would have been saved, because what tended to happen was, so that surgeon that had to amputate, the problem was they didn't keep their instruments clean. They might wipe it on their apron or whatever and go from soldier to soldier. And so in that way they spread disease, infection, and that's what really was deadly. It wasn't really the amputation or the other types of surgery, it was the fact that they weren't controlling infection. And they had no medicines. There were no antibiotics to control any type of infection, and so that was really the main problem when it came to the surgery. Now, ironically, in 1865, the very year the Civil War ended, Dr. Joseph Lister, a British surgeon, conducted the first antiseptic surgery, and you can see what he did as he did the procedure. He sprayed phenol solution over the patient, and that helped control the the bacteria that was in the area where surgery was going on, in addition to keeping his instruments clean and such stuff like that. And this was based on the research largely of Louis Pasteur, a French microbiologist who had started working with things like yeast for brewing yeast, and had moved into the idea of bacteria and other microbes as being the source of a lot of disease and infection. And so Lister built on Pasteur's idea, and in the end, modern aseptic surgery was the result of that. But the Civil War, unfortunately, was a little too early for that to have made an impact. The other problem that there just weren't effective medications, and so this is kind of the types of medications. This is a little selection of some things we have in the collection, and a lot of these things are basically alcohol. Anything that's a tincture. Now there are good medicines that are tinctures. That's mixing with alcohol, but in the late 19th century, a lot of you think of like the snake oil that you could buy, that kind of thing, was mostly alcohol. And a lot of these medicines were that. Some of them were herbal. There were a few quite effective medications. One was quinine for the control of malaria, for the prevention of malaria. And actually that had been established in the 1820s. It was a derivative of a South American plant. And it had been found that if that was used, your chances of not contracting malaria in tropical areas was much reduced, so that was available, and that was particularly important in the battles that took place in the American South, where malaria was more prevalent. The other big problem during the Civil War was what they called hospital gangrene, and so that was after surgery, and it was basically tissue death that would occur after the surgery, and they found that bromine was a pretty effective method of halting that, but it was a pretty crude way of doing it, but it did work, and there would be other better medicines developed later to do that. And then the other thing was to control pain. Morphine was available and other opium-derived medicines, and that was a double-edged sword, as we know. It helped control post-operative pain, but also was highly addictive, and so you have the problems that go along with that. But other than that, there wasn't much for effective medication other than those kinds of things. Now, as the war went on, the medical system got better organized on both the Union and the Confederate side, but particularly on the Union side, which had more resources. And so this is Armory Square Hospital in Washington, D.C., which was one of the big main hospitals. And I think there were something like 24 big hospitals that the Union was operating by the end of the war on this scale that could treat hundreds, even thousands of soldiers at one time. Now, the other thing that was the bane of troops during the Civil War was just the spread of communicable disease. And this is a picture of a typical encampment of the Army of the Potomac, which was the big Union Army in the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. And just looking at this, you can tell it's unsanitary. You have all the animals that were necessary, both for the cavalry and for pulling wagons and such. So you have the waste that goes with that. And of course, you have sewage problems with all the people. You're literally hundreds of thousands of troops that you're dealing with here. And so all of those things contribute to the spread of disease. And then the other big thing that was problem in the Civil War and World War I was a lot of the soldiers were farm boys off of isolated farms that hadn't been exposed to a lot of communicable disease, particularly childhood diseases like diphtheria, measles, typhoid fever, things like that. And so they were very vulnerable to that. They had no tolerance to those kinds of things. And so the rates of death from those kinds of diseases were very high in both the Civil War and World War I. Now we go to the Spanish-American War. Now, by the time of the Spanish-American War, which occurred, the main part of it occurred during 1898, between the spring of 1898 and the fall of 1898. In the Spanish-American War, that was mostly over the status of Cuba, which had been a colony of Spain going back to just after Columbus's time in the 16th century. But the United States, for strategic reasons, desired to get Spain out of Cuba, and so the United States, for various reasons, went to war with Cuba. But Spain also controlled the Philippines. And so in 1898, the U.S. Navy destroyed the Spanish fleets both in Cuba and in the Philippines in a few weeks span. And then there was a major ground invasion involving Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. And we have a painting here, the charge of San Juan Hill in July of 1898. But the actual main part of the Spanish-American War was quite quick. And as you can see, even though up to over 300,000 Americans served in the Spanish-American War, only 385 were actually killed in battle. The rest of the deaths were the result mostly of disease. And it's easy to see why. Cuba, for instance, is a place where tropical diseases is a problem, particularly malaria, yellow fever, typhoid fever, and then the Philippines also. Now, the part of the war that's not generally thought of in most to most people when they think of the Spanish-American War is the Philippine component to it. The war in Cuba was fairly well over in 1898, but in Cuba there was a civil war that broke out in 1899 that the U.S. troops were involved in that drug on until 1902, and it was a nasty affair, as all civil wars are. Over 4,000 U.S. troops died in the Philippines between 1899 and 1902, and as you can see, a good percentage of those deaths were as the result of non-combat reasons, and mostly those tropical diseases. But out of this, a lot of good information was gathered. Now, in the Spanish-American War, the weaponry had changed a great deal. First off, kind of the older small arm that was available was the model 1873 Springfield rifle. That was the first U.S. rifle that shot a cartridge with a brass case. It still was black powder, but it had a self-contained cartridge. It was a single shot breech loader, though. The weapon was loaded in this area of the gun instead of through the barrel, and so it could be fired much more rapidly. This is the typical gun if you think of Custer's Last Stand, the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. Most of those troopers were using a carbine, a shorter version of this rifle, but they were still being used by some outfits during the Spanish-American War, and I did want to mention them. And of course, you also have the revolver during that era as well, a single-action revolver. But the big innovation right before the Spanish-American War was the U.S. Army adopted its first repeating rifle, and that was the model 1892 Craig Springfield rifle. And this was Craig Jorgensen was a Danish rifle company that the U.S. Army awarded the patent to, the contract to, and they developed this bolt-action rifle that could hold 5 rounds. They also developed a new cartridge, the 3040 Craig cartridge, which was the first. The 1873 Springfield cartridge was black powder. The 3040 Craig used smokeless powder, which was a more powerful propellant for the projectile. And so, as you can see, the individual firepower was going up by the time of the Spanish-American War. The other thing that really came into play was the kind of the forerunners of modern machine guns. The big thing during the Spanish-American War was the Colt version of the Gatling gun. And the Gatling gun actually was developed during the Civil War, but it wasn't used much during the Civil War. But during the years between the Civil War and Spanish-American War, it was refined. And so this version built by Colt that fired the 3040 Craig cartridge was heavily used. For instance, it was in place during the Battle of San Juan Hill in 1898. And so this wasn't a modern machine gun. It was a rotary weapon that had multiple barrels. But you can, of course, if you watched old cowboy movies, you have an idea of how that operated. It was capable of firing 700 rounds per minute, so it had great firepower. Another early machine gun that was used in the Spanish-American War was the 1895 Colt Browning that the U.S. Navy used. But that was not used a lot, a little bit. Now, The other thing that had been developed in these years between the Civil War and the Spanish-American War was bigger and faster repeating artillery. And one of the big things was the 1875 Hotchkiss revolving cannon, which was a little bit like a big Gatling gun, except instead of firing a regular cartridge like the 30-40 Craig, it fired a great big artillery round like this that could even hold an exploding shell. So that was a formidable weapon that was used in the Spanish-American War and in World War I. And then you also had the Hotchkiss mountain gun, which was a single-shot weapon, but fired basically a bigger version of that 37 millimeter round that I just showed you. And then there was the really big gun, big artillery piece during the Spanish-American War was the 3.2 inch artillery gun. And this was one of the first artillery pieces that was a breech loader. So instead of the Civil War era cannons were loaded from the muzzle, just like the muskets were, this was loaded from the back end of the gun. Okay, in terms of medicine during the Spanish-American War, the U.S. Ambulance Corps was operated much better during the Spanish-American War. It was well established since its experience in the Civil War. One of the newest technologies that was available during the Spanish-American War was X-rays, which had been developed by Wilhelm Röntgen in 1895. And so X-rays were very important not only for seeing the extent of broken bones and such, but for finding bullets and other foreign bodies that were in somebody. And so X-rays were a big innovation that were used. And there is an image here of an early X-ray machine being used aboard a U.S. naval vessel off of the coast of Cuba. And then here we have a picture of a typical field hospital in Cuba also. Now, as I said before, the big problem in the Spanish-American War was tropical disease. And so up to 75% of all the U.S. servicemen that served in Cuba came down with yellow fever, malaria, or typhoid fever, or dysentery. And so many came down with it that even after the fighting stopped, they couldn't. The U.S. military couldn't just send these guys home. They were so sick, and so they actually established a huge hospital camp on Long Island called Camp Wyckoff. And it was huge. Thousands of troops had to be treated there until they got well. It was basically a big quarantine hospital. And here we have a picture of a Red Cross nurse treating a young soldier that was sick with one of these ailments. Now, to make for a local connection, here's a great picture of one of the local Sioux City area Iowa National Guard units that was reporting for duty for service in the Spanish-American War in early 1898. This picture was taken right by City Hall on Douglas Street, right north of 6th Street. And these guys never made it to Cuba at all, and this was a big problem during the Civil War. A lot of these National Guard units reported for training in places like Georgia and Florida and Pennsylvania, and they got sick with kind of a lot of the same problems that occurred for those that did end up in Cuba. In fact, the men from Sioux City they were training in Georgia, and so many of them got sick with yellow fever that they had the U.S. Army had to charter a special hospital train just to get them back to Iowa. They were in such bad condition, and so just in training, a lot of casualties were taken, and. During this time, in training, over almost 1,600 troops died of disease during the Spanish-American War. Now, the big thing that came out of it were discoveries that were made as a result of the problems that were experienced during the war. And they involved Dr. Walter Reed, which we know from the Walter Reed Medical Center, one of the U.S. military's great hospitals. The U.S. Army Surgeon General was George Sternberg, and he appointed a couple of different commissions to study all the things that went wrong. And Walter Reed was involved in both of them. One was a typhoid panel, and Walter Reed headed that. And they figured out that they determined that flies were a major spreader or a vector for typhoid fever. And then the other big thing was they discovered that people could carry typhoid without actually being sick. And though, we all probably have heard of Typhoid Mary, Mary Mellon, who a few years after this was found to have been a major carrier of typhoid fever, infected many dozens of people. And so that was a big problem also, because somebody that wasn't sick could make somebody else very sick. And so that was a big thing. And then the second panel that Walter Reed headed was the yellow fever panel, and they confirmed a Cuban doctor, Carlos Finley's theory that mosquitoes spread malaria, or spread yellow fever. And they were the vector for that. And so that really had a big impact from that point on, that yellow fever could be controlled by controlling mosquitoes. And that was really important, for instance, during the project to build the Panama Canal a few years later. Now, in the Philippines, there were other commissions that were appointed, and the Sternberg's successor, Robert O'Reilly, appointed a tropical disease panel to discover what happened in the Philippines. And the big thing that came out of that was they discovered, with the tropical disease panel, discovered that dengue fever, which was a major problem in tropical areas, still is, was also mosquito-borne, just like yellow fever. And then they also discovered that beriberi, which is another condition that was common especially in the Pacific Basin, was the result of a B vitamin, a thiamine deficiency, for overdependence on white rice. And so that basically the troops serving in those areas where white rice was a staple food had to eat other things to diversify the diet and not have problems with beriberi. And then the other big body that came out of this was the Dodge Commission, led by General Grenville Dodge, and we all know Grenville Dodge from the Dodge House down in Council Bluffs. He was a Civil War hero and a prominent Republican official during the late 19th century, and he was appointed to this big commission to discover, or to find out all the things that went wrong during the Spanish-American War. And one of the big things when it came to the medical department was that it just needed to be bigger and more well organized. And so as a result of that, the U.S. Army established its Permanent Nurse Corps in 1901. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a good picture of them, so I posted a picture of the first U.S. Navy nurses in 1908, so they followed suit. And then also, the U.S. Army Medical Corps became its own distinct thing in 1908. And so from that point on, it just became a much more efficient system. So now we get to World War I. So World War I began in 1914, and the U.S. stayed out of it until 1917. And so to a degree, depending on how you look at it, the U.S., compared to the other combatants, took much lower casualties. But the thing is, when you think about it, the U.S. really was only in combat in World War I from March 1918 until November 1918. And in that time, over 50,000 U.S. service people were killed in combat. And so they were in some very heavy fighting at the end of the war to bring it to a conclusion. Almost 5 million U.S. Citizens served in World War I. And just a small fraction of them actually came into combat in Europe, but it was enough to turn the tide against Germany and its allies and bring the war to an end. Now, as you can see from the numbers, World War I, if it hadn't been for the flu pandemic that broke out right at the end of the war in late 1918, early 1919, World War I would have been the first war in human history in which more people died of combat reasons than from disease, because of the medical advances that had been made. Unfortunately, the non-battle deaths that the U.S. suffered, which were over 63,000, about 40,000 of those were influenza deaths, right at the very end of the war. So that was just a tremendous thing that happened, just to kind of like a terrible thing to happen right at the end. In this picture we have some what was called the American Expeditionary Force, was what the U.S. troops served under. They're fighting in the Meuse-Argonne offensive in the fall of 1918. And so when the U.S. came, the U.S. troops really weren't involved in the trench warfare too much that we think about when we think about World War I. When they came in at the last minute to kind of turn the tide. And so they were involved in very much straight-ahead frontal assaults into these very, very fortified works that the Germans had. And so U.S. troops took pretty major casualties in these final battles of the war. Now, in World War I, the firepower had expanded exponentially from where it was in the U.S. Civil War. And so the U.S. had, right before, in the decade or so before the outbreak of World War I, adopted a new rifle, the Model 1903 Springfield, which shot the 30-06 Springfield cartridge. It was a 5-round bolt action, but much improved on that 1892 version that we saw for the Spanish-American War. Another innovation that they had was the idea of the stripper clip. And I have an example here. In that stripper clip, you could put all 5 rounds right into the breech, and then you just pulled that clip right out, and it loaded it that fast instead of having to load each cartridge individually. So you could reload your weapon much quicker as a result of that kind of simple little technology. The other big thing about the 30-06 cartridge was that it was rimless, so it had a groove instead of a wide rim like the 30-40 Craig did. So that was another innovation. Actually, the rifle that was most used by American troops by a small amount was the Model 1917 U.S. Enfield rifle, which was very similar to the 1903 Springfield. This was just a British made. It was the British Enfield rifle was very similar, and so this was a British manufactured Enfield. That shot the 30-06, and a lot of U.S. troops used that as well. Very similar. Another new weapon during World War II was World War I was the first automatic pistol, the Model 1911 Colt. So that was developed right before World War I and increased firepower as well. Now, the thing that really changed the character of World War I was machine guns, and that's what made defending a trench so effective was the presence of machine guns like the Vickers Model 1915 and the Hotchkiss Model 1914. So these guns, if you were in a fortified position, a few of these machine guns could hold off hundreds of attacking troops that were just trying to do a frontal assault on a trench position. And so it was a reason for just the terrible casualties on the Western Front in World War I. The other thing that was widely used in World War I because of the presence of the trenches was mortars. And mortars are designed to shoot a projectile on a high trajectory so that you could, if you're in a defensive position, you can launch it up and over and onto them. And so the 3-inch Stokes mortar and the 58 millimeter mortar Type 2, which was a French mortar, were widely used by U.S. troops during World War I. And then probably the main artillery piece during World War I was the French 75 millimeter gun, which the U.S. Army had adopted before World War I. And that shot this big shell. It's probably one of the bigger fixed rounds that any artillery piece ever used, meaning that it had a case just like a regular rifle cartridge. And so these were very widely used. In fact, probably the most famous 75 millimeter gunner of World War I on the American side was future President Harry Truman. Was in a battery of 75 millimeter guns during the war. In World War I, about 2/3 of all combat fatalities, were the result of artillery fire. So from these big shrapnel and things that came from these big artillery pieces. And here's just a big 155 millimeter howitzer, another great big gun that was used during World War I. So as a result of this, first off, defensive equipment had to improve. And one of the big improvements was the steel helmet. And so U.S. troops used the English designed Model 1917 Brodie helmet. Brodie was the guy that designed it in Britain. And U.S. troops used it. It's also sometimes called the Doughboy helmet after U.S. troops during World War I. And so that was a big improvement because when you had all the flying debris because of these huge artillery barrages, that helped protect you a lot better than a cloth cap cap did that most of the combatants started World War I with. And so all sides by the end of the war used steel helmets of some type. The other big thing that we think of with World War I is the use of poison gas. Things like first chlorine, phosgene, and then particularly mustard gas came into place after 1915. And so both sides developed increasingly effective gas masks. And the U.S. troops used the Model 1917 small box respirator, which was another British design. So both British and American troops used this. And that really helped with ingesting poison gas into the lungs. But like mustard gas, not only was terrible for the lungs, but it actually would kind of go to where kind of under your armpits or in your groin area and create terrible burns. And so poison gas didn't cause a tremendous number of fatalities, but it was something that everybody was horrified of. And it's a lasting image of World War I is the use of poison gas. Now, the other big thing about World War I, it was the first really mechanized war. And when you think about it, the airplane was just invented in 1903 by the Wright brothers. And between 1914 and 1918, airplanes were completely developed into effective fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes, and so that's how fast the war pushed that kind of technology. And U.S. flyers used the SPAD, which was a French plane. And in fact, Eddie Rickenbacker, probably the most famous American ace, flew a SPAD during World War I. U.S. troops also used a British plane called the SE-5 is another example. And so many of the Allied aces flew planes like this, and these were fighter planes. The other big thing that happened during the war was the development of the tank. And the British were the first to introduce the tank during the Battle of the Somme in 1916. This is an improved version of their early tank from 1917. And so these were designed to cross the barbed wire and even the trenches and try to break the stalemates that were in place because of the trench warfare. And the most produced tank on the Allied side was the French-made Renault light tank that we have a picture of here. And so those were made in the thousands by the end of the war. And so as the war went on, it became increasingly mechanized, and the idea was and that would foreshadow what would happen in World War II, which was very much where World War I was a static war. World War II was a war of movement and of machines, and so that was the precursor to that. Now, really, as I said before, other than the flu epidemic, World War I was the first conflict where disease in a major way was kind of brought under control. One reason for that was the first wide use of vaccinations for the British and American forces in particular adopted mandatory vaccinations, and they were vaccinated for smallpox. There was an improved smallpox vaccine that had been developed by Sidney Copeman in the late 1800s. There was a typhoid fever vaccine developed by Almroth Wright around the same time in the 1890s. And then Edmund Norcard developed a tetanus antitoxin that was quite effective as well. And so these guys that you see here, U.S. troops, are being vaccinated. And so this is the first time that, this is a pretty common scene of induction scenes then, like in World War II and afterwards, where the troops are getting vaccinated for everything. That first took place in World War I. The other big thing that came out of World War I was the U.S. Sanitary Corps. So you had the Medical Corps that kind of took care of the actual surgery and caring for the wounded and the sick, but the Sanitary Corps was in charge of keeping conditions as clean as possible and was made up of people that were professionals in those areas. And they could be biologists, they could be people that were specialists in waste management. So the Sanitary Corps was a really important unit during World War I and really helped make the kind of the overall operation much less disease-ridden than it had been in previous conflicts. And so we have here, of course, World War I is the first war in which you had the widespread use of motorized vehicles like trucks and cars. And so we have a laboratory truck set up for the Sanitary Corps. You have a bacteriological department where they could do tests on water samples and things like that to make sure that they weren't infected with microbes. And so that was an important development. Here we have a couple more local pictures. These are local National Guard troops training out at what today is just south of Riverside Park. This was the Sioux City Fairgrounds where the Interstate Fair was held, and in early 1917. They were doing their training out there, and this happens to be the ambulance company for this particular National Guard unit, Iowa National Guard unit, and so they're getting ready. You have the stretcher bearers and some of the first aid responders. So these are the forerunners of the modern combat medic that are training here. Now, the treatment in World War I was much more developed over what it had been, say, in the U.S. Civil War. First off, this was the first war that had motorized ambulances, and so we have a Ford ambulance here. The use of X-rays was pretty much all was used by everyone, and so you have a truck fitted with a mobile X-ray machine. These were called Little Curies because Marie Curie, the famous radiologist, was a big advocate of using the X-rays during the war, and so that was really important to use that technology and helped people recover from wounds they sustained. The other thing was during World War I, the kind of tiers of treatment centers was much more advanced. And so right behind the main lines, you'd have a dressing station like you see here, which was just right out there in the combat zone. And then once that dressing and sanitization took place, the person then was moved back to a more well-equipped hospital, and it would just keep moving depending on how severe the injury was. They would go back to facilities that had more and more equipment and more resources. Here we have some examples of field hospitals. So we have, and so these are the ones that are right out there in the open with close to the troops. First off, the other thing that I would point out, by World War I, the idea of aseptic surgery was in place. And so that means not only was it antiseptic, they weren't just fighting microbes. In aseptic surgery, it was completely sterilized, the situation. So it's very much like modern surgery. That was in place. The other big thing was the treatment of wounds was really improved by World War I. And the big thing they did was, so if you had a major wound on a limb, for instance, the first thing they would do is they would make sure to remove any damaged tissue. So tissue that just wasn't going to survive, they got rid of it as fast as they could, and then they doused it in antiseptic solution and kept it that way. And that made survivability from wounds much, much better. And so I think I've read statistics that people that made it to a hospital, about 95% survived if you lived to get to a hospital in World War I. So that's a pretty tremendous record. Big thing that developed by World War I was the idea of safe blood transfusions, and that can't be overstated how important that was. The beginnings of it were in World War I, and it was fully developed in World War II, but the idea of being able to give somebody that had lost a lot of blood, either blood plasma or whole blood, was a huge development, and this couldn't happen really before World War I because people did not know about blood types, the different blood types, and so what had always been the problem with blood transfusions was if you gave somebody the wrong blood, it would clot, it would have a reaction to it, and the person would die. And so blood transfusions were really anathema to a lot of medical people until the era around World War I. And what started it was a doctor named Karl Landsteiner, an Austrian physician, discovered the main human blood types in 1901, the A, B, O, and then finally AB system. And so that was the big one that they figured out that some of those reacted, which ones could be given to each other and which ones couldn't. So that was one step. And then the other thing was a couple of American physicians, Peyton Roos and Joseph Turner, developed a process that preserved blood for a longer period of time. They mixed it with citrate and glucose, and that allowed it to be stable for a few days. And so you didn't have to immediately transfer it from one person to another. And so the beginnings of the early blood banks began in World War I. And then the other big development was Oscar Robertson, another American, came up with the idea of having blood depots, having storage facilities for the wounded, and so that was another major development during World War I. Now finally we come up to World War II, and so in World War II, The U.S., first off, was involved in it much earlier than it had been in World War I. The World War II started in 1939, and the U.S. entered the war at the end of 1941. The other problem the U.S. Faced was it fought the war in both the European theater and the Pacific theater, and they were in vastly different environments. And so U.S. troops during World War II had to deal with the desert environment of North Africa, the continental environment of Europe, and then the tropical environment of the Pacific theater, and all the attendant problems that came with them. So I have a picture of troops landing at Omaha Beach during D-Day, and then troops landing at Iwo Jima, and so quite different. And I guess at Iwo Jima, those are Marines that are landing, and so very different places that U.S. personnel had to deal with. By World War II, you can see the non-battle deaths were just way down. By World War II, you were much more likely, if you perished, it was a result of a battle wound than it was of disease. And it was much more likely, actually, in World War II to die of an accident of some sort because of the use of machines. And so, for instance, in World War II, I think something like 700 U.S. troops died just training for D-Day, for the D-Day landings, and a lot of that had to do with the result of all the mechanical equipment that was used. By World War II, the U.S. was using the M1 Garand rifle, which was the first semi-automatic rifle used by a major military. Still used the 30-06 cartridge, but instead it had an 8-round in-block clip that could be inserted at one time. And so by semi-automatic, instead of being a bolt action like that 1903 Springfield, it was as fast as you could pull the trigger. And so it had a much higher rate of firepower. This is also the point where the submachine gun became important. The most widely used of World War II was the Thompson, which had been developed in the late 1920s. We usually think of the Thompson as the weapon of the gangsters in Chicago, the Chicago typewriter, but the U.S. military used a version of it widely in World War II. Also, the M3 submachine gun was another one. Troops called that the grease gun because of how it looked. And that was a widely used, and so these were fully automatic weapons that could fire as many rounds as the magazine could hold. And more submachine guns. The machine gun was still important in World War II, but less so than it had been in World War I, because the individual troop or Marine was, especially in the European theater, the war was much more mechanized than World War I had been. And so the individual military person wasn't as much the focal point as it had been in previous conflicts. Here we have the M2 heavy machine gun, which would have shot these 50 Browning machine gun rounds that I have here. So basically a supersized 30-06 type shell. So these could be used against airplanes or against enemy troops. You also have another repeating gun that shot a 40 millimeter round, the Bofors cannon. That was another widely used weapon during World War II. Of course, more mortars, just like the mortar was still important, still is to this day during World War II. And of course, we have some of the field artillery important, but what I want to get to is some of the machines. So World War II, in Europe in particular, it was really the tank that was the focal point of the ground forces. And the U.S. started the war with the M3 Stuart light tank, which had a 37 millimeter gun, so fairly small. But as the war went on, they went to the M4 Sherman tank, which was a medium tank, and had a 75 millimeter gun. And really, these became, the idea of armored units like this really became the driving force. The Germans, in many ways, pioneered this early in the war with their idea of blitzkrieg, but the U.S. developed it very, very fully as well by the end of the war. And then, of course, the airplanes were all important during World War II. Both the Air Force and U.S. Navy aircraft carrier based planes. And so in World War II, the individual battleship, for instance, wasn't that important. What was important were the aircraft carriers, and in the Pacific theater and in the European theater. And so we have examples of different air fighter craft that were used. And of course, World War II was the era of the long-range bomber, like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator that were used in Europe, and then eventually the B-29 Super Fortress that was used for the bombing of Japan late in the war and eventually delivered the atomic bomb. Now, the Sanitary Corps was very active in World War II as well, and you get a sense, so we have a picture here of a Sanitary Corps officer in Iceland and another one in New Guinea. And I can't think of two more opposite environments to work in than those two places. But one of the big drugs that was available to fight malaria was Adabrine, which had been developed by the Germans in the 1930s by Bayer Corporation. And that was an effective replacement, a synthetic replacement for quinine to combat malaria. World War II was the point where blood banks really took their modern form. And these are the results of, first off, right before World War II, Karl Landsteiner, who had first developed the blood, or discovered the blood type system, did a further refinement with Alexander Wiener, where they discovered the Rh factor. So that's the negative and positive component of your blood. And they discovered that in 1939. And so by that point, once that was discovered, blood types were really well understood. And so this led the way to large-scale blood banks during World War II. A lot of the credit to that goes to Dr. Charles Drew, who organized large-scale blood banks for U.S. troops, both whole blood and blood plasma. So that was exceedingly important. Then finally, to finish up, the other big development right before World War II was the development of sulfa drugs, sulfonamides. And they were the first really effective antibacterial drugs that came into place in 1932. Protonsil was the first one. And so these were the first ones, if you had a bacterial infection, they could cure you. Basically. And so it's hard to overstate how important that development was for treating communicable disease. There also was large-scale air evacuations during World War II. You had all different types of planes that were used to evacuate the wounded. The first helicopter was used to evacuate the wounded in World War II. And then finally, also, the idea of the combat medic really integrated into the individual military units was fully developed in World War II, where each unit had its own medics that were out on the battlefield and surgery teams that were back in the field hospitals. And then finally, the other huge innovation during World War II was the bringing to market of penicillin, which was the kind of a major improvement on the sulfonamides. Penicillin had been discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, but they early on, for about 10 years, they couldn't figure out how to produce a lot of it. And finally, in 1940, Howard Florey and Ernest Chain came up with a technique for developing it on a large scale. And so penicillin was a super effective antibacterial that didn't have as many of the side effects that a lot of people had bad reactions to the sulfonamide drugs. And so penicillin was an improvement on that. And it was really World War II, the emergency of World War II brought penicillin into large-scale production by 1943 and really made, once that was in place, bacterial infection was really well under control in World War II compared to what it had been before.